Hello, and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. When someone disappears, when they vanish seemingly into thin air, it's disturbing. It bothers us because it plays with our sense of safety and security. It bothers us because we don't understand how someone can be in a place one moment and gone the next without leaving any evidence or any kind of trail as to where they went. I think what bothers us the most is the unknown. It's human nature to like to name and label and organize everything into categories. When someone disappears, we cannot do any of those things because we don't have the answers. Now, imagine 5 people disappearing all at once. How on earth could that happen? One person disappearing is difficult enough to comprehend, but 5 people vanishing at the same time? It happened. It happened long ago on a dark street in Newark, New Jersey, and for decades there was nothing but questions and sleepless nights for the families of the missing. This is the story of the Clinton Avenue 5. Let's get into it. August 20th, 1978. It's a hot summer evening in Newark, New Jersey. Parents are home cleaning up from dinner or relaxing in front of the TV after a long day at work. The heat of the summer beats down on the city, and when the sun goes down, the kids come out to play in the streets. They ride their bikes and they play night games and live a pretty carefree life in the innocent world that existed so long ago. The economy at the time wasn't great. People were working hard and barely getting by, and kids were left to entertain themselves for the majority of their summer break from school. Crime rates were on the rise all over the country, but nothing like what was happening in Newark. In the 1970s, the crime rate rose about 25% nationally. In Newark, New Jersey, it rose 91%. That statistic is mind-blowing. I actually double and then triple checked it because it seems too unbelievable to be true. But by a percentage or so, it is. Newark went very quickly from a nice residential suburb to a dangerous, terrible place to live. People wanted out. They wanted to leave, but most of them couldn't afford to. And the ones who could, they got the hell out of there. Between 1960 and 1990, the population of Newark decreased by 33%. That's 125,000 people who, if they could afford to, moved. It was not a safe place, and it was no place for children. The city was filled with abandoned buildings and shuttered businesses. It was also common for people to lose their home to the bank, and then when the bank took the house back, it would just stand there vacant. Abandoned buildings are prone to catch fire, and many of them did. In 1975, Newark was given the title The Worst City in America by Harper's Magazine. It wasn't a place really anyone wanted to live, but some had no choice. It's very important, as you will see later on, that we talk about the socioeconomic climate in Newark at the time because it plays a very big role in this case later on. In 1967, an incident occurred that sparked a year of terrible unrest in Newark. On July 12th, a black cab driver was severely beaten by 2 white police officers for nothing but a minor traffic offense. Racial tensions had begun rising in the city for years, but this incident, much like the Rodney King incident in California decades later, served as the match that lit the powder keg. Word quickly spread of the cab driver's beating, and the people began to riot. The riots started on July 12th and lasted for 5 days. When they were over, 26 people were dead, hundreds were injured, and millions of dollars of property had been damaged and destroyed. Whenever I think of riots, I think of that old African proverb, a child who is not accepted by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. That saying always gives me cold chills because you can look at it from a crime standpoint, like we do with serial killers, where a child that's neglected and abused then grows up to perhaps do terrible things. But you can also look at it in the way that when people are mistreated and pushed down and oppressed for so long, they burn down the old system and create a new one. Can kind of go either way. Newark never really recovered after these riots. The city didn't spend the money to revitalize the damaged and destroyed areas. The riots only served to increase racial tension, and the powers that be seemed determined to let the neighborhoods inhabited by people of color waste away. Weeds grew up around the buildings, and like I said earlier, abandoned buildings were left to rot unattended, and soon the area was just not a nice place to be. Those abandoned buildings provided hiding places and shelter for people doing nefarious things to hide what was going on in those buildings, and that would end up becoming a pivotal part of this story. I found some very old news footage that demonstrates the racial tension at the time and just how angry the people were at the deteriorating city and how they were fighting about just what should be done about it.
All I got to say for you is,
Leroy Jones in your mouth.
Leroy's no bit of yeah.
Racist slob.
And there's other little degenerate.
I believe the towers will be built unless, some white boy drops out of the clouds, with some illegal legality, that's gonna make it impossible or something like that. But in terms of the way it is now, we're gonna build it.
The racial confrontation is not going to end in Newark, and it's certainly not going to end in this country in the near future. I think we'll always have race and racial problems as long as people will not learn to live together. And apparently they're not going to learn in the next few years.
Senior citizens, like in the 80s and 90s, were forced to walk up 13 flights of stairs because the elevators never run. We have 1,206 families and only one policeman to protect the lives of all these people. During the winter seasons, we hardly ever have heat or hot water.
On this hot August night in this very tough city lived a group of friends, a group of boys that had all grown up together. They were Melvin Pittman, Alvin Turner, Ernest Taylor, Randy Johnson, and Michael McDowell. All of the boys were either 16 or 17 at the time. The boys spent a lot of time together. They hung out at the park, they played basketball, they rode bikes, they walked the streets of town, and it was common to see them together in the neighborhood. It was well known that the boys liked to make a little money and that they would do odds and ends, small jobs for people for a few dollars. The boys were a tight-knit group. They went to school together where they tried to get in the same classes together. And neighbors remember that when you saw one of them, you usually saw a few more of them. They were great friends, and they were kids who didn't get into trouble. Only one of them had ever had a scrape with the law, and it was a few years earlier, a very minor infraction. Early in the afternoon on August 20th, the boys had played in a baseball game. When the game was over, it was dinner time, and the boys split up to head to their respective homes and eat dinner with plans to meet back after they did so. Two of the boys told their parents that they were going to go back out and help this man, Lee Evans, move some boxes around at his business, and that Lee was going to pay them for helping him. Each of the boys finished their dinners and were then quickly out the door to meet up again. Now, remember, this is 1978. There are no cell phones, there are no Ring doorbells, there are no surveillance cameras on the streets. Our parents didn't know where we were every second of the day, which is something that now is just totally inconceivable to us. We told our parents where we were headed, they had a general idea, and then off we went, and we were expected to be home when we said we would. It's something we just kind of can't wrap our minds around now. We're all right in reach now. We always have our cell phones on us, and that just was not the way that it was for a very long time. The boys headed off into the night, and a neighbor saw the group of them walking together around 11 o'clock on Clinton Avenue. No one ever saw them again. By morning, their parents realized that all of the kids were missing and the alarms were raised. One neighbor reported that he saw Randy Johnson walking down Fabian Place around 7 o'clock. Another neighbor said they saw Melvin Pittman walking by an ice cream parlor on Fabian around dusk, which would have been around 8:45 at night. A store owner came forward and said that he had seen Ernest, Alvin, and Michael riding in the back of a pickup truck being driven by Lee Evans at about 8 o'clock. So at this point, everyone knew that the boys had all gone back downtown, and they knew that at least 3 of the boys had been with Lee Evans. Lee was a local carpenter, and he had a small business as well. He sometimes enlisted the area kids to help him with small tasks, and he would give them a little money for their help. After the disappearance, everything kind of pointed back to Lee, tracked back to him, and the last sighting of the boys around 11 o'clock. Lee Evans was immediately located and brought in for questioning. He was in his mid-20s and was well known in the community. He went by the nickname Big Man. Lee told the police that he dropped the boys off in kind of a central neighborhood location at 11 o'clock by the ice cream parlor on Fabian Place near Clinton Avenue. Well, that was very convenient because Lee knew that someone had said that was when they had last seen the boys. So from the get-go, it kind of appeared as though Lee was trying to make his story match up with what was already being said. The police put Lee Evans on a lie detector test. Now, you know how I feel about those things. They're not reliable, they're not conclusive, and no one should ever take one. But Lee did, and he passed. This was good enough for the police, and Lee Evans was crossed off the suspect list. Then, as I guess is to be expected, the police started asking the parents if the boys had all run away. What if they'd had a plan to do this? Why were they out so late? It's too difficult to believe that all of them could have disappeared at the same time, right? All of the parents were insistent that their boy would not run away. And some of them even told the police that the boys had future plans even the next day, that they wouldn't want to miss out on. Some of the parents went directly to Lee Evans to confront him. Floria McDonald, the mother of Alvin Turner, later reported that Lee was, quote, kind of smart and nasty with her. She said she got a bad feeling from him. Then a few days after the boys disappeared, one of the mothers got an anonymous phone call. The caller asked for her by name and then said he knew where the boys were. The caller told this mother that he would give out their location for $750. And when this mother said she didn't believe the caller, he hung up. So she called the police, who came right to her home, and they put a trace on the call. The call came from a payphone in Washington, D.C. at Union Station. So Newark police contacted Washington police, who rushed to the payphone. But of course, by the time they got there, the caller was long gone. After that, a second anonymous call came in telling the Newark police that the boys were in jail in Washington, D.C., and that he would pay their bail for $150. Well, after a bit of investigation, both of the calls were written off as pranks, but they did find it interesting that both callers tied the boys to the Washington, D.C. area. The search for the boys was pretty intense, which is nice to hear and somewhat of a change from what we might expect, especially for this time period. After the police very quickly eliminated Lee Evans as a suspect, they branched out and began looking at other area residents. Anyone with a criminal record, especially involving children, was questioned. One police officer recalls that he spent weeks at his desk doing nothing but talking to suspect after suspect. He said the days began to run together and his frustration grew with each person he interviewed because he wasn't hearing anything he hadn't heard 100 times before. No, I didn't see the boys. No, I didn't take the boys. No, I don't know what happened to the boys. The police enlisted the help of boats and dive teams. The area rivers and ponds were dragged. Scuba divers were sent into the waters to try and find any clue as to what happened to the boys, and they found nothing. I read some accounts that said psychics were brought in to try and assist the police. Prayer services were held, but nothing helped. The Newark cops contacted police departments all around the country, mailing and faxing, when possible, missing persons flyers with the boys' names and photos on them. They had family members of the boys brought in so they could swab their cheeks and use whatever primitive DNA methods they had at the time to possibly match DNA from the family members to bodies that were in the morgue. They knew that was a long shot, but they did it. Then, after months had passed, cops began to wonder, could it be possible that the boys were taken to Jonestown, to Guyana, to join Jim Jones' cult? Could these 5 boys be among the dead, laying in that field in the infamous photos? Did they drink the Kool-Aid? This theory started to take hold. It made some degree of sense because at the time, stories were coming out of Guyana about people who had been kidnapped and forced to join this cult. There were stories about how Jim Jones needed manual labor, and some theorized that a group of young, strong boys would be very attractive for someone like Jones. So, as if the investigators at the Jonestown massacre did not have enough to deal with, can you imagine? Enough bodies to go through. They were tasked with trying to look for and match up bodies of any victims that looked like they could possibly be one of the boys the press was now calling the Clinton Avenue Five. Nothing ever came of any of this. A new theory began to float around. Wayne Williams, the Atlanta child killer, hadn't yet been discovered, but police knew of a series of murders taking place in Atlanta. Many of the murdered were black kids. What if the Atlanta child killer had come north? What if it was more than one person? Could all 5 of these boys have fallen prey to someone like a serial killer? Despite all of the theories and investigation, the searches and the science that was involved, there was never any trace of the boys. Months went by, and then years. Several years into the investigation, they brought back a couple of the psychics they had talked to earlier on. They also brought in a police psychic that had been used in other cases and had had some success. I don't know how you feel about police psychics. I haven't seen enough evidence to make me believe in them, but I understand why people get desperate and why they utilize such techniques. One of the psychics took the police to a park, and that park was searched. The other psychic took the police to a lake that had already been dragged. With every effort and every new investigative technique came another dead end. A decade went by, and then 2. The case remained open, but there were absolutely no new leads. The Seattle Times wrote a story about the vanishing in the early 2000s, and the gist of it was, have you ever heard of 5 people disappearing off the earth? Well, that's just exactly what happened. There was simply nothing after that to help investigators, and there really wasn't for a long time. I've actually wanted to cover this case for a while because I've been fascinated with it for years. Every time I see it on my list, I skip over it because the truth of the matter is it's really difficult to make a 30-minute episode for you guys about cases where there is so little information. But I finally decided I was determined to bring you the story even if this episode was going to be a little shorter. But there are new developments. I wish there was more details about the early days of the investigation. There just aren't. This case, as strange as it is, went absolutely stone cold for 30 years. 2008. Newark police get a very unexpected phone call. There is a man in prison who says he wants to speak with whatever detective is working on the Clinton Avenue 5 case. The man's name is Philander Hamilton, and he has quite a story to tell. Philander Hamilton is Lee Evans' cousin. He tells the police that his cousin Lee was convinced that the group of boys had stolen a bag of pot from him. Lee said the boys knew about the pot from times they had previously helped Lee move things around his place of business. Philander stated that Lee told him he was going to pick up the boys, and he asked Philander to meet him at an abandoned house in the neighborhood. Philander thought Lee was going to do something to scare the boys in retaliation for stealing his pot. He says instead, he watched in horror as things went from tense to horrific. Philander claims that Lee started yelling at the boys, that he pushed them into a corner and then forced them into a closet in the abandoned home. He said Lee then nailed the closet shut, trapping the boys inside. Philander initially thought that would be the end of it, that the boys would have to break the door down and that hopefully that experience would teach them a lesson about stealing. Instead, he watched as Lee brought a can of gasoline in the house from his truck, poured it around the closet and the family room, and set the abandoned house on fire. Philander claims that he ran from the house as the gasoline was being poured and that he didn't watch Lee light the match because he didn't want to see it, but that he watched the house go up in flames and then collapse, killing the 5 boys. Police were stunned. They weren't even aware of this man. He hadn't even been on their radar. But as soon as they heard the story, they were pretty convinced it could be true. They were quickly able to collaborate the fact that Philander Hamilton and Lee Evans were in fact cousins, and then they began looking for information on the fire. Now, this is why it was important to talk about the socioeconomic climate earlier on and the abandoned houses. So police start trying to find records from 30 years ago. Now, if you've ever worked for a government agency, you know they do not keep records any longer than they have to. So the records were not there, but there were still people from the neighborhood and some firemen to talk to. But again, Because this was such a rundown area with so many abandoned buildings that caught fire quite often, a lot of times the fire department wouldn't even bother to go and put the fires out. So the records were gone because so much time had passed, and even if they had been available, the fire department might not have even attended the fire. That's how bad it was in Newark at the time. Philander Hamilton knows the exact location of the house that he claims all of this took place in. The police are eventually able to determine that yes, there was in fact a fire at that location in 1978. Not only was there a fire there, but it was a large fire that totally destroyed one house at that location, and then the fire spread to surrounding houses as well. There were some new structures sitting on some of the lots, so the police got their hands on some advanced ground-penetrating radar equipment, hoping that if there were 5 bodies, even one body, somewhere in the location, the radar would indicate the location of the bones. It found nothing. Not a thing. There was no evidence of human remains anywhere in the area. At this point in time, Philander Hamilton had spent about 13 hours being questioned by the police, and they believed him. Even if they didn't have the bodies to prove the crime, there were other indications that Philander was telling the truth. The investigation and the location search took over a year, but at the end of that time, they felt like they were getting somewhere. Based on the information Philander gave authorities, police asked the district attorney and then a judge for an arrest warrant, and it was granted. In March of 2010, Lee Evans was arrested along with his cousin, Philander Hampton, and both of the men were charged with murder and arson. The cops knew their case had problems. They brought in a cold case forensic specialist who told them that yes, even in a large fire, if the bodies were in that house and not removed after the fire, the bones would remain. If you recall, we talked about this in my episode called The Sodder Children Disappearance, where 5 children supposedly died in a house fire. Problem was there was no bodies. And we talked about the science. Bones don't burn in a house fire. It takes much greater heat to destroy bone than the heat that occurs during a structure fire. Police knew the fact that they hadn't found any bones would be a huge obstacle for them in making their case. Then the brother of Ernest Taylor, who was one of the missing, comes forward and told police that about 18 months before Lee Evans was arrested, he had confessed to him, telling him, yes, he had killed this man's brother and the other 4 boys. So now they've got 2 people saying that Lee Evans has confessed to them. Bail for Lee Evans and Philander Hampton was set at $5 million, but was then reduced to $950,000 for Lee Evans because the judge felt he had strong ties to the community. Okay. Lee Evans' family actually posted his bail in the form of titles from 3 pieces of property they owned, and Lee was released pending trial. As the investigation continued, police discovered a 3rd man that was most likely involved in this kidnapping and the fire. His name was Maurice Woody Olds, and he was also a cousin to Lee Evans. Now, Maurice unfortunately wasn't a factor because he had died in 2008 before Philander Hampton came forward. As word of the arrest spread, something really quite amazing occurred. A man named Roderick Royster came forward and said that the night the boys disappeared, he and his brother were supposed to go with Lee Evans and help move boxes. Roderick and his brother even got into Lee Evans' truck with him, and they were ready to drive off. But then their father came out and told them to get out of the truck and go home. He didn't want them going anywhere with Lee for some reason. I feel like this might have had something to do with the fact that people knew Lee smoked pot. Roderick also told police that a couple of hours before the disappearance, Michael McDowell, one of the boys who vanished, gave Roderick a couple ounces of pot and told him that he was holding almost 7 pounds. Roderick said to Michael, "Where did you get 7 pounds of pot?" And Michael didn't tell him, but Roderick assumed it was stolen from Lee. The police felt they had all they were ever going to get. They knew it might not be enough, but it was all that was ever going to be, and with that, they went to trial. 2011. Philander Hampton went on trial in August of 2011. He pled guilty and was sentenced to 10 years. He ended up doing about 6.5 years and was released in 2017 and then put into witness protection. Why? Because he had agreed to testify against his cousin. Lee Evans went to trial in November of 2011. He decided to represent himself and appeared without an attorney. Philander Hampton took the stand and told the courtroom that the memory of the terrible event had been, quote, wearing him down, and that he was looking forward to telling his story and getting it off his chest. Now, at some point in time, there must have been a defense attorney involved because he accused Philander of only bringing up Lee Evans' name because he knew the police already suspected Lee. The accusation was that Philander was placing all of the blame on Lee because the cops had already looked at him and maybe he was the killer. The prosecution's case really hinged on whether or not the jury believed Philander Hampton. They had no physical evidence and they had no bodies. Lee Evans was not equipped to defend himself. It's always kind of incredible to me that people think attorneys go to school for 8 years to learn nothing, that they can just get up and do what attorneys do. But from time to time, it does work. Even though Lee did not handle himself very well in the courtroom and he missed major opportunities to hammer away at the 20 witnesses brought in to testify against him, in the end, there just wasn't enough evidence for the jury. Lee Evans was acquitted of this crime and was free to go. Now, there are a lot of people who believe that Lee Evans is innocent. He has his supporters. I don't know. Lee Evans was not satisfied with being acquitted. He wanted revenge. In 2013, he filed a civil suit against the city of Newark, against Essex County, and then he alleged Mayor Cory Booker, who he was also suing, used this case to get reelected as mayor. Lee Evans made claims of malicious prosecution and a violation of his constitutional rights. Quite quickly, most of the allegations were dismissed, but as of now, in 2022, the case is technically still open from my understanding. I'd like to imagine those boys are together somewhere, playing basketball and cracking jokes. It's a nice thought, but it doesn't look like there will ever be any justice for the Clinton Avenue 5. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Hit that like button if you like the video, it helps. And if you want to join my Patreon, that is very much appreciated. I'm kind of in limbo right now. I'm making some decisions about what I'm going to do after the first of the year. It's tough here, it's tough. So your support is greatly appreciated and so are your views. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.